All right. Hello, everyone. I'm going to start talking about Lab 11. This is due not on October 31st. Good news. Sorry, not on November 2nd. It'll be November 9th. This is due. Okay. So you have a week of not with lab. Okay. So we're learning about plant diversity. This is not about plant evolution, but I thought it was cute. This is a houseplant reaching for a knife. It's evolving. So we're going to be learning a little bit more about plant classification. In Lab 10, we learned about animal classification. So all plants come from a photosynthetic common ancestor. These were unicellular without specialized tissues. Remember, we had this whole specialized tissues versus no specialized tissues and the creation of more specialized tissues with animals. It's similar to plants, okay? So the green algae is the original. Multicellular came next. First, without vascular tissues. Basically, they just had to be wet all the time. And there's the ones that don't have vascular tissues. With vascular tissues, they would disperse their seeds via spores. And then these are the ones that do that. Dispersed by seeds, gymnosperms or angiosperms. Okay? So this is a vague sort of the evolution of land plants. Very simplified. I will show you a slightly more complex one in a minute. But this shows you how long it's been. Again, when algae began, and there's still algae around. Okay, that's one of the more ancient plants. When algae began, it was everywhere on Earth. Remember how we had that big die-off after the Permian era? Well, the sea became pretty uninhabitable, and so it was beneficial for plants to start coming on land after that. 500 million years ago was when land plants came up. Again, they were in the water for a long time. 500 million years ago, they came up. And then they had to start adapting to life on land because it's very different than life in the water. So, when they came up on land, they had to do a couple of things that they didn't have to do in the water. First, they had to avoid what's called desiccation. They had to keep from drying out. So, to do that, they got a cuticle, which is basically like we have a waterproof cover on our skin to keep us from drying out. Well, they got a waterproof cover on their leaves. Also, these pores were developed, stomata that could open and close, basically let air and water in and out. So more control over what goes in and out of the body. Support. Realize that organisms don't need to have support in the water. Sort of how a whale can't walk on the land because it's just too big and it's meant to float in the water. Plants that came on land had to adapt to stay upright. So seedless vascular plants got something called lignin in their cell walls that helped them to stand up taller and stronger. Basically, it's the woody part of plants. The cellulose also became tougher and woodier. Think of a comparison between like a palm tree and a grass species. Grass is softer and floppier, and so having a tougher, woodier, being able to stand up taller was beneficial. Also internal transport. Before, when you were looking for getting sugar from one place to another, well, you just, being a unicellular organism, you just had the sugar nearby every place you need the sugar. Also, there's no reason to have any way to transport water because you're surrounded by water. But when the water is only in the soil and you need water in your leaves, you have to figure out how to transport it. So this vascular system transports water and nutrients from the soil and also transports sugar from the leaves down into the roots. Finally, keeping gametes moist. So because of kind of the structure of animals, we've never struggled with the keeping gametes moist. We basically always create, all animals create gametes inside their body and then put them out when needed, okay? But because plants are so different from us, keeping gametes moist is actually a big issue. they don't have the same structures and like ovaries and other things that, to keep the gametes moist and inside. A lot of times the gametes were just out there. And so how do you keep these moist and prevent them from dying before they meet another gamete? So these containers were created, okay? Seeds, ovaries, and cones. We're also going to talk about what's called a gametophyte. These bodies to hold eggs and sperm to prevent drying. And it's different than an ovary. Ovaries do exist, but gametophyte bodies are a weird thing that only plants have. So let's talk about this. Again, we have these algae. We have these spores or zygotes encased in a tough coat of pollen. Sure, to keep the spores or zygotes safe. But when they came on, most key innovations for living on land evolved only once. You don't have like a bunch of them evolving a cuticle over time. Cuticles were necessary and one of the first things that evolved. Okay. Then the stomata, these openings. Then the vascular tissue. Then roots. Then true leaves. Then wood. And then the vessel elements. The vessel elements did evolve more than once. We had the vessel elements for the ferns, vessel elements for the club mosses, vessel elements for gymnosperms and angiosperms. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about vessel elements when we get there. So again, we have the non-vascular plants, mosses, liverworts, hornworts, non-seeded plants, seeded plants. Okay. So one of the first things that they developed after a cuticle was this vascular system. Okay, so some organisms have vascular systems, some don't. Now note that even though I have you memorize all of the types of phyla that we learned about in the animals, plants are actually a bit more complex, and there's so many phyla. So we're not actually going to be memorizing all the phyla. Instead, you're going to be memorizing groups of phyla that all match the same thing, and you can just learn their common names. I'm not going to make you learn the names of each one of these, okay? So, xylem itself. When things got vascular system, the xylem is the large holes here, okay? It transports water from root systems and leaves. It can also transport dissolved calcium and anything else that they need. Phloem, responsible for transporting food, usually goes from the leaves to the roots. And so it moves it around from photosynthesizing parts to non-photosynthesizing parts, okay? So the phloem is these larger dots as part of that, okay? Plants themselves have evolved this interesting life cycle. Remember I talked about the keeping gametes from drying out. Well, the first thing to do is seeds were not developed right away, but when they were on land, suddenly their gametes were drying out. And so what's interesting is that, so we have a sporophyte, a normal plant that you think of. So we'd be a sporophyte. We don't have something like the gametophyte though, okay? So a sporophyte does meiosis. Sure, we do meiosis. We create eggs and sperm. And then it creates these spores. The key is that when we create gametes, we're done. Those are our gametes. We hold them inside our body until we're ready to use them. Or basically forever for females. Instead of waiting until fertilization happens, instead, these spores, the product of meiosis, goes through mitosis, becomes a different one in plant, a haploid individual. Same species. They have the sporophyte that makes spores. The spores make the gametophyte, and the gametophyte makes the eggs and sperm. Weird. That extra mitosis and creating a new organism after. It would be as if your eggs that you were creating in your body, instead of just being an egg that met a sperm, your egg first turned into a mini human and went and walked around and then made a little egg and then met a sperm that was walking around. It would be weird. But plants, again, are very different from us. And this is one way to prevent drying out. If you're able to create an actual new plant and then make the sperm and eggs in that plant through a special type of meiosis, basically a half measure of meiosis, now you have eggs and sperm. It's weird, but it works. In comparison, here is our life cycle. Okay, we have zygote. Zygote goes through mitosis into a diploid or multicellular organism, and in meiosis, you just have a egg, and then a sperm comes and meets it, and then you have mitosis again. There's no mitosis between the first meiosis and fertilization. That's different for plants. So these are important because I'm going to explain gametophyte versus sporophyte and how that all works, okay? Again, this is the concept. We have a zygote, goes through mitosis to become bigger, and then you have the sporophyte, and that sporophyte undergoes meiosis to create spores. The spores go through mitosis to create a haploid multicellular organism, multicellular, and then that multicellular organism itself puts out eggs and sperm. Weird, for sure. Some protists do something similar to this. So not only plants, but it's definitely very different than humans or animals as we would know them. All right, so let's talk about the major morphological differences among land plants. Okay, so we have non-vascular tissue. Non-vascular plants. These are some of the earlier plants because vascular tissue was developed pretty soon after they came on land. Basically, these have a cuticle, but they do not have vascularity, which means they don't have any way to transport water or food, okay? So they do photosynthesis here, but they do photosynthesis in most of their body, and basically it's just osmosis that brings it from the top to the bottom. They're very small plants. Most of them, are mosses, okay? And they don't have a lot of structure or support in their body, and so they're very floppy, very squishy, if you've ever picked up moss. They use spores, not seeds, for dispersal. Okay, we'll talk about the development of seeds and what is different about the seeds. Seedless vascular plants are the next step up. So before seeds, but after the development of vascular tissue, this helped plants to be a little bit more upright, okay? Gives them a little bit more structure inside of their stems and their leaves. But they still don't make seeds. They're still using spores for reproduction, and from these spores, they create a sporophyte that then from the spores, they create a gametophyte, and that gametophyte will then turn into an actual organism, and the new sporophyte will grow from it. So I'm going to show you that with ferns. Seed plants themselves have vascular tissue and also make seeds. So seeds are more than just seeds are complex, okay? The idea is that you have the embryo, but you also have a nutritive tissue around it, okay? And a tough protective layer to protect the growing embryo inside. The embryo is the actual, you have basically the embryo occurs in the angiosperms, it occurs inside an ovary. And once the ovary is fertilized by a gametophyte's sperm, it will swell and grow around it, and then there's seeds inside, okay? Gymnosperms do it a little bit differently. They don't have an ovary per se. I will show you some pictures of gymnosperms. But basically they have this embryo and a store of nutritive tissue. Think of it more as like chickens are always creating eggs, but they're only sometimes fertilized. Those eggs are sort of the seed of a chicken. Because there's no embryo inside of it unless it's there, but chickens will still create eggs. And so, but it has the same concept here. It has this store of nutritive tissue around in a hard casing, okay? So think of chickens sort of as the seed creators of the animal group, okay? All right, so the next thing we're going to talk through is the different groups that have different combos of these traits, okay? So again, remember, you don't have to remember Bryophyta, but remember what mosses have and do not have, okay? Mosses are non-vascular, okay? So they are the first iteration from a algae to the land, gaining a cuticle and losing a little bit less water, okay? One interesting thing is that their gametophyte is bigger than their sporophyte. Okay, what does that mean? Well, trees are sporophytes. Sporophytes, as different things became, they became more common. So the trees create spores. Spores turn into a gametophyte, but the gametophyte itself is like a pollen grain. And that pollen grain has the ability to, it is multicellular, but it's very small, okay? In mosses, though, the gametophyte is bigger than the sporophyte. This is also true with algae. Algae does the same thing, and its gametophyte is the primary living, which means that they are one in mostly. Two in only to create the spores, which create more one in. Weird, I know. So the sporophyte generation appears as small pods on stalks. Okay, this is the only bit of two in. Everything else is one in. Diplosporophytes, they're parasitic on the haploid gametophytes. They can't live on their own. Alternatively, you have the opposite true with the gametophytes as part of trees. The seeds in those cannot live on their own. Okay. So haploid gametophyte generation produces sperm and eggs. They fuse to create sporophytes. So sporophytes produce more spores, which divide by mitosis and create new gametophytes, which make eggs and sperm. Okay. Most of what you see here is, again, the one-in generation, those spores that came from these little capsules. And the capsules are the ones doing the sexual reproduction. Sperm does have to swim to the egg. Okay? This does become less true once you get enclosed seeds. But sperm has to swim to the egg, so the moss has to live in moist areas. You don't see moss in dry areas, or if you do, it's dead. Liverworts are a different kind of non-vascular plant. Okay. Unfortunately, I can't show them to you in class. It's fun to look at them. So they don't really have a stem or leaves in particular. They are gametophyte dominant as well. Okay. So you have this egg and the sperm. So the sperm goes into the egg in the archegonium, which is part of the gametophyte. The sporophyte grows out of that, and it grows as again, a parasite. So they're gametophyte dominant is what it's called, but so are mosses. So Lycophyta and Pteridophyta are seedless, vascular, and spore producing. Okay, so Lycophyta is gametophyte dominant. Lycophyta is what's called a club moss. Okay, Lycopodium. They look a little bit like mosses, but they have more structure because that vascularity gives them structure. And what you see is mostly the gametophyte, the one in, and then they have these small sporophytes, which have these spores in them. Okay, and the spores themselves will then fuse, will come together, and they still need water to move the sperm to the egg. Okay. So they can't live in dry areas. These are called club mosses. Again, they look like really tall mosses. They have more structure. Pteridophyta. Sounds like a pterodactyl, right? I wonder if they were named after that because they kind of look like they're made of, they have wings, okay? So these are ferns. These are seedless and vascular and spore producing, but they are sporophyte dominant. That is the key difference. They have what's called true leaves. So they do have vascular leaves. Lycophyta doesn't quite have those true leaves. So the ferns look like this. They have these little dots. These are the sporangia. Sorry, the sporophyte creates spores and the sporangula. The spores make a gametophyte, and the gametophyte is very small, and it creates egg and sperm, and then the sporophyte grows from the gametophyte. And I will show you pictures of that later. Okay. So this is a picture overall of what's happening. These mature sporophyte, okay, the seedless vascular plant, through meiosis, it creates these spores. Spores dispersed by the wind, and then once it lands, it develops into a gametophyte, this multicellular but small organism. The mature gametophyte has a archegonia and an antheridia. Okay, archegonia is the place where the eggs are made, and they have little spots for the eggs to sit, and a sperm in the antheridia. The sperm swim to the egg and fertilize in the archegonium. The gametophyte sprouts out of the sporophyte sprouts out of the gametophyte, and then the gametophyte dies after the sporophyte is big enough. Seeded plants was one of the final developments. As I said, one of the things is that swimming to the egg, well, what if you're in a dry area? And again, they don't have true ovaries or testicles or like liquid running through them the same way that animals do, okay? So the haploid gametophyte is very small in plants with seeds. Pollen, each pollen is not that many seeds all packed together into this little thing. What the pollen is able to do is germinate on top of a anther of a other seeded plant, and then it travels down. It deposits its sperm onto the seed. The seed itself is as an egg, and of course the encased part, the chicken egg part of the non-fertilized chicken, okay? Non-fertilized chicken egg. And once that sperm gets down there, it fertilizes that, and the ovary then swells. That's for this is for ones with flowers. So the ovule is the mature female gametophyte, okay? So this is the ovule here. It is unfertilized. It has eggs in it, and it's hidden away by the plant in some way. So this is hidden away by the plant in cones, but the cones sort of just create, they are naked seeds, and the cones just create, like, it has some sort of way to protect the actual growing ovule. The pollen itself is a mature male gametophyte containing sperm. It's free living. It doesn't need a lot to survive. It only grows its pollen tube when it's on a plant of its own species, and that pollen tube is sort of like it's a winding path for the sperm to travel through. Okay, gets to the ovule. So here we have in this gametophyte, the pollen grain lands. It puts the pollen tube down into the ovule, which is in one of these segments. Basically, each of these scales contains a female gametophyte. So each of those scales is a female gametophyte, and it travels down, puts it into there, and then that swells into a seed. And that seed can then be planted on its own. Okay, so gymnosperms are known as naked seeds. Once the seed is formed, it's open, it's naked, it doesn't have much protecting it, okay? They have naked seeds. Fruiting plants protect it in this ovary around it, but there's no ovary here. It's these scales. The seeds then swell up and then eventually will be dispersed. So we think of pines and ferns when we think of gymnosperms. Right, so you have this, each of these scales has, it's a megaspore mother cell, okay? Inside of that is so this is a megasporangium. It's basically the part that makes the gametophyte, and it's hidden away. And the pollen cone makes these spores, which develop into pollen, okay? So the meiotic division, again, female gametophyte develops inside of this megasporangium being part of the sporophyte. The gametophyte develops in here, so now you have an egg. The pollen lands on the egg, on the scale, puts the tube into there, and it develops into a zygote. Okay, that's the fertilized egg. And then it creates the actual seed with the living embryo in it, and that can turn into a seedling. Okay. Angiosperms. Angio is known as a container. So these are not naked. Instead, they actually have a container for them, and that container is their ovary. Okay. So when you eat a zucchini or an apple or anything that's a fruit that has seeds inside of it, you are eating the ovary of a plant. Don't let it gross you out. We eat a lot of ovaries. So seeds develop inside of the ovaries within their flowers. The ovary only swells if there is fertilized eggs inside of it, okay? So if you don't have a pollinated zucchini, it's not going to develop zucchinis. So there are perfect flowers that are both male and female, or there's imperfect. There's too many phyla in gymnosperms and angiosperms to memorize. Just know that angiosperms are flowering plants. Anything with flowers is an angiosperm. Anything without flowers is a gymnosperm that has seeds. All right, so mature sporophyte, we think of it an apple tree, okay? So from the apple tree, the male gametophyte forms the male spore, which turns into a pollen grain, multicellular, okay? Each of these pollen grains has sperm in it, and the female gametophyte is inside of this ovary. The ovary is part of the actual tree, while the inside, the developing seed, is part of the gametophyte. Okay, gametophyte has it produces the eggs, and it has basically this part that's an embryo. The seed is the embryo part. The seed is the food for the embryo. Once the pollen gets to the seed, it fertilizes the egg inside of there, and it turns into an embryo. This swells inside the seeds are growing, and so once those seeds get into the ground, they can then turn into mature sporophytes. I will need you to know some of these cycles and understand how they are different, okay? Generally, the seed cycles are very similar. All right, we don't have live samples. I do have some videos of these. So the green algae, these chlorophyta, it shows it's sort of a think of these as sort of the sponge version of plants, even though the sponges are just sort of like loosely associated cells without differentiated tissue. So is the green algae, okay? So it has these daughter colonies inside of this gelatinous group. And so this like sort of a multicellular colony. And eventually they start sticking together and created mosses. But the algae itself is a bunch of loosely associated cells. I would have had a plant display. I love the plants there. I love it so you can touch them and see them. I won't be testing on the kinds of plants because you really can't see them. But understanding this is the moss, remember, non-vascular and spore producing. And then this is the liverwort, also non-vascular and spore producing, okay? So you see the difference here, there's sort of these broad leafy things that don't have true leaves, and then these sort of fuzzy, fluffy stuff. Boston fern is an example of a seedless vascular plant. And then Lycophyta, the club moss, so it's called blue spike moss, and it has, it's better if you see these in person, obviously. Obviously there's angiosperms and gymnosperms. And there is a video on there it shows microscope slides in the lab, okay? So you look at the predators such as land plants. You can look at these in the videos. Let me actually show you where the video is. Pull up that video. Yeah, man. So the video is actually in lab materials. Let me drag this over, okay? Lab materials, you go to lab activities. You go to quiz 4, lab 11, okay? And here, what you're going to see is, again, tested in the assignment is just a few things. But you will need to know things like what phyla are vascular or non-vascular, have spores or seeds, or are sporophytic or gametophytic, primarily dominant, which have flowers, which have fruits, etc. How the plant life cycle works, what evolutionary adaptations came first, and then we're also going to look at this cuticle and leaf adaptations for xerophytes. Okay, so there's this cuticle video, so you can compare the cross sections. And we'll look at that right now, but it helps you to understand that different things have different types of leaves, okay, once you have leaves. So I'm going to run through those real quick, but again, you have the volvox, you have cuticles, the fern rhizome, so this is sort of like a fern root, kind of, an underground root, and then pollen grains, and fern alterations, okay? So I want you to be able to identify these and see these different parts. Again, you don't have to worry about taking photographs, sort of a weird thing. But let me go back real quick to the PowerPoint. So this cuticles and leaf adaptations, I do want you to understand what the different adaptations are. So let's go back here. I will show you some pictures, but checking this out. In these leaf adaptations, you can look at the hydrophytes, okay? And you can see that they have these big air pockets that help them float. And they just don't really have a cuticle. They like to live in the water, so they don't need to keep the water in, and they don't have to keep from drying out, okay? If you look at the mesophytes, though, these are ones that they have a thin cuticle, thin waxy cuticle. More packed in, okay, and they have these, obviously these, they're not extreme, okay, so they don't have a very thick cuticle, but they do have a cuticle, and then they have these various layers of mesophyll, and they have the waxy cuticle part where they don't have and the stomata is facing away from the sun, okay, so that lets air in and such. Gives you a little bit more information about those. And then the xerophytes. Okay, so understanding that xerophytes, they have very thick, fleshy leaves. They hold a lot of water inside. And so thick, waxy cuticle, and they have this, they have space inside where they hold a pile of water, okay? And they also keep their stomata closed mostly. So you can read about those pieces, all right? And the fern alterations, I'm going to show that to you in the PowerPoint, but you should know how ferns go from... so ferns go from spore to fern, okay? So I'm going to show you the pictures up there, okay? And hydrophytic have thin or non-existent cuticles. They have got these spongy mesophyll, these big air pockets, okay? There's a cuticle present in mesophytes, okay? They adapted to some loss of water. Think of like plants that live in moist areas but not super dry and not super wet, okay? Doesn't need constant rain. They have to have waxy, maybe hairy leaves. They live in moist soil. They have large veins for transporting water, which the hydrophytes tend to lack. A lot of garden plants are mesophytes. They're sort of the in-between the dried out completely and the completely wet, okay? So if you have something, your grass is probably a mesophyte. Anything that has flowers and fleshy leaves and not these thick, hard leaves is going to be a mesophyte. Cuticles, so xerophytes are dry. Under a microscope you'd see a thick cuticle. We don't have a microscope to show this to you, so I will ask you what would a xerophyte have, but you don't have to identify it from a picture. It would make you to identify it from a picture if you actually were looking at the microscope. But in the thick epidermis, they're often succulent, okay? Very thick leaves. This reduces evaporation, and some will keep their stomata closed all day. They don't need all of water. Here's a picture. These you might have a succulent garden, very squishy, thick leaves. And that helps them to hold on to water for a long period of time and use it in times of need. So the fern rhizome, again, there is a video that you can look for the fern rhizome, but here I wanted to just show the xylem and the phloem, okay? So in the rhizome, it has this endodermis. It protects the, basically it's the coating for the vein in the plant. They have the smaller circles are the phloem, the bigger inside circles are the xylem. In a regular plant, so this would be, say, a woody plant instead of a fern. You'd have the xylem near the near the inside of the plant, and the phloem near the outside. Okay, but the phloem is these smaller bundles, and the xylem's the bigger bundles. Okay, because bigger bundles are carrying water. So that's why xylem has a larger diameter than phloem. You need more of a fire hose for water. All right. Also, this shows, we don't have these, I don't have a setup for these in a class, but, in the actual videos, but understanding what basically the male strobulus in a pine tree, a gymnosperm has, okay? So this is a male cone. It produces haploid spores, okay? So you have these microsporophyll and microsporangium, okay? That's where the pollen grains are created. Okay, pollen grains leave then this area. Okay, it's called a microsporangium. It's small. It's creating a small gametophyte. A sporangulum will in the megasporangium, the female sporophyte. I'll show you a picture. It will remain. So the gametophyte stays inside of the megasporangium as it develops, so protecting the seed itself. Eventually, it will produce haploid gametes. So here's a picture of the mature female strobulus cone. This cone is part of the diploid. The sporangia itself in here will create a small megagametophyte. It's much larger than the other thing, but it's attached to this diploid part, okay? So the spore will grow into a haploid individual, the gametophyte. It remains within the female sporophyte and swells into a fully developed seed as it grows, okay? Again, the seed part is always there. If it's pollinated, it will swell up into a bigger seed. The haplogametes will pollinate, it puts a tube down into this hidden part, okay? So it is hidden away, but once the seed is developed, it is not encased in anything. Result of seeds, okay? Finally, here is the fern gametophyte. Do look at these alternations. So I'm going to show you the where you would go. This is a fern alteration, so you can go to YouTube to watch it.
The preservation of the developmental biology film series.
Okay, so this shows you the sporophyte to the gametophyte
form
and development.
Attracting secretion.
And so it shows you the whole sexual reproduction here, but the main thing I want you to know is at the beginning here, this process here, okay? But this is a picture on the PowerPoint. This is a gametophyte. Okay, the gametophyte is this heart-shaped thing. It has two different parts in it. It has the archegonium that creates the eggs, and the antheridia that creates the sperm, okay? So this is called a prothallium, which is basically the small leaf, okay? And this is a sporophyte growing out of the archegonium, okay? Because the sperm will swim to the archegonium, and then the sporophyte grows out of there, okay? I know it's a lot to take in, especially with plants being so different than us, but those are the main things I want you to be able to understand. I'm not going to be testing you on, what is this? Because you really didn't get a chance to really get a handle on those pieces. But I will ask you to explain maybe what is the archegonia in a fern. I will ask you to explain things like how does the explain the life cycle of a plant and when mitosis and meiosis happen. So again, two sets of meiosis of multicellular gametophyte that produces eggs and sperm instead of just eggs and sperm from the adult two-in. All right, that's all I have for now. If you have more questions about how to do this, again, all you're going to be doing is answering these questions. Describe how terrestrial plants prevent drying out, collapsing under their own weight, having their gametes dry out, and having their embryos dry out. That's 3 points. 1 extra point, 4. Naming one of the plant phyla or groups, okay? Remember, there's lots and lots of phyla in the seeded plants, but you can just say a gymnosperm or an angiosperm. Okay, but you need to name a separate phyla. If there's some crossover here, you'll get a little bit less than 1 point bonus. Okay. And I'll put the PowerPoint. I'll put the video here. Okay. Everyone have a great week. And obviously next week on Tuesday and Thursday, you can ask questions about this lab.